Hey everybody, so we're going to do the bees today. Bear in mind this is supposed to be yesterday's lecture, but I forgot that Canadians don't give a crap about American Thanksgiving because you already had your Thanksgiving. Today's Black Friday, another day that Canadians couldn't possibly care less about, but in the United States, people will run around getting some sort of deal and getting various deals, trampling each other into children and transmitting COVID pandemically, while Canada basically goes back into lockdown and treats the outbreak responsibly. Anyway, so let's go over bees. And I'll upload this lecture immediately after this. I'll have office days hours today from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, and I'll put an announcement out for that. All right, so bees. There are about 16,000 described species of bees. There probably are many more species than that, but we have no real estimate of what that would be like. But it's probably more like 20 to 25,000, but we have no idea. With wasps, we know that there's like an infinitely large number that we haven't actually identified to species. Ants, we have a pretty good estimate because using some logistic regressions, we can estimate how many species are yet unidentified based on how many new species we identify every time that we go out to a jungle. But with bees, we don't have such samples, we don't have such estimates, so there you are. Rather than having one family like ants, bees actually have 7 different families. Many bees are colony forming, so they can be like the eusocial honeybees or bumblebees or stingless bees. But you should know that the average bee, the vast majority of the species, are solitary, and they're usually named after whatever kind of material they build their singleton nest with. So it can be mason bees making like little clay out of water and soil. They can be carpenter bees, which burrow into wood. They can be leafcutter bees, which cut up leaves, and then sweat bees, which usually live in the ground. But I actually don't know why sweat bees are called sweat bees. It's probably because they're oftentimes salt limited. Anyway, so sweat bees, as we'll get to in the end, famously exhibit geographic variation in sociality, but most of the species that we discuss here, we'll be talking about them as being strictly colony forming or aggregation forming, weakly eusocial or highly eusocial, but at the end we'll talk about some species of sweat bees that exhibit geographic variation in sociality, which helps to illuminate some of the factors that are important for the evolution of eusociality. All right, so bee, general biology. So pretty much anywhere there are flowering plants on planet Earth that are insect pollinated, i.e. not just wind pollinated, there are bees. What do bees eat? Well, almost all bees eat a combination of nectar, which is that sweet sugary stuff that flowers give and rewards they give pollinators. And then bees also, but you can't just live on sugar water alone like Honey Boo Boo. In fact, you have to have some other nutrition in your diet to substantiate a life, even a small insect, modest insect life. And bees obtain that additional proteinaceous nutrients through consuming pollen as well. So although they're transmitting pollen and that's good for plants for reproduction, they're also eating a fair bit of that pollen, and they have specialized structures for carrying pollen, both for foraging purposes and then inadvertently for the flowers themselves. Larval bees are usually fed just big chunks of pollen because it's protein rich and it's nutritious, and so it's important for their development. They're provided a small, modest bit of nectar, but mostly it's just pollen. Notably, all bees across the world are in global decline, and so about 25% of there's been a 25% decrease across all bees since around 1980s. Over the last 40 years, we've seen about a 25% decrease in the global representation of bees. And most of those bees that have been most susceptible are not the European honeybee, which is doing quite well for itself because we love it and we keep reproducing it all over the place and farming it basically, but more native bees that are struggling. And that's because they don't do so well in agricultural settings. They're not really easily cultivated. They're not kept in apiaries. They rely on natural resources like strips of wildflowers or woodlots to persist and build their colonies, and there are just fewer and fewer of those as people keep reproducing and spreading across planet Earth and changing it all. All right, so where did bees come from? Well, I've mentioned before that bees are just basically highfalutin kinds of wasps. So the evolutionary precursor to all bees was a predatory wasp, probably something like the extant family Cabronidae, which is depicted on the right here, which kind of looks like a bee, right? But that's a wasp. And so that precursor, the ancestral honeybee, was a predator. And sometime very early on in the proliferation of bees, they became pollen foragers. Nobody really knows how that happened, but the best hypothesis goes a little something like this. They were eating pollinators, other pollinators that were moving pollen around, and they were getting nutrients from pollen in addition to the prey carcass that they were consuming as a predator, but they were getting nutrients out of the pollen. And then just because pollen was so nutritious, it allowed them to evolve a more and more efficient digestive capacity to consume that pollen. And then one day they just decided, in fact, it's easier just to get the pollen itself and just never mind trying to attack these pollinators. And so bees became these really efficient pollen foraging herbivores now. Some people call them pollen predators, but whatever, they're herbivores. All right, so when did these things show up on planet Earth? When did these bees show up? About 100 million years ago, about the same time as ants. And then all the contemporary divisions that we'll talk about today were present by the late Cretaceous, 45 million years ago. I guess that's actually past the Cretaceous, but near the end of the Cretaceous period, about 45 million years ago, again, roughly coinciding with when ants started to experience their heyday, and around the same time that flowering plants were evolving and proliferating, going through radiations all over planet Earth. So Apidae, which is the most famous family of bees, like Apis mellifera, the honeybee, the most famous bee, probably the most famous insect apart from maybe ladybugs on Earth, appeared about 87 million years ago. Let's see, bees are not average pollinators. So we talk a lot about bees being pollinators, but you know, the reality is that lots of insects pollinate, lots of wind pollinates things, flowers, flies pollinate flowers, butterflies, hummingbirds, moths. I mean, any kind of insect that flies at all can pollinate a flower, and oftentimes they do. But bees are especially good pollinators because they have a few morphological adaptations that render them especially good at picking up pollen and transporting it. So almost all bees have something called scopal hairs, which are hairs along the ventral side of the abdomen and usually on the hind legs as well, that have evolved especially to pick up pollen. And then they transmit that to the next flower as they move around in the environment. And that's important because that means that they're just picking up more and more of effectively the ejaculate of these flowers and then transmitting it around in the environment as a vector of reproduction for the host flower. Famously, honeybees and a small number of other apidae that are not honeybees have these pollen baskets on their hindmost limbs that can actually have dense aggregations of pollen. I mean, although that's good for the flower because they're transmitting that around, they'll visit multiple flowers and some of that pollen will fall off. Notably, a lot of the pollen in that pollen baskets those pollen baskets are actually destined to go back to the hive where it will be consumed and provisioned across colony members and especially developing larvae. So these special scopal hairs, which are present across most bees, and pollen baskets, which are restricted to a small number of bees but are especially good at carrying pollen, are believed to have been special morphological adaptations that help to cause the expansive radiation of flowering plants, which in turn caused further proliferation in Apoidea, the bees. So there's a bit of a positive feedback loop between the speciation of honeybees and flowering plants. And lots of other organisms that are speciose today basically hitchhiked along the radiation of flowering plants, which include lots of things that consume those flowers or parasites of those flowers or use them as resources or use them as hosts. So honeybees, in combination with a feedback loop of speciation and diversity with flowering plants, have actually caused the proliferation of most of the evolutionary winners over the last 50 million years of evolution. Eusociality. Well, you know what eusociality is? Eusociality is defined here among honeybees a little more narrowly. So there still can be reproductive division of labor across bees that are not mother and child or siblings with a shared mother, which is this typical eusocial insect structure. But there can be reproductive division of labor among sisters in honeybees. So related sisters can co-found colonies together, and some of those sisters eventually just take on strictly sterile working type behavior. They could reproduce, but they don't. And they just spend their lives assisting their sisters in producing offspring and have no offspring of their own. So they're effectively sterile, but they've elected to do so. So their ovaries atrophy and they become, but they are still inseminated. They could hypothetically lay eggs, but they just forego that in favor of helping their sisters. So that kind of reproductive division of labor is called semisociality among the bee people. social insect biologists just make up terms all the time for their specific literature, because oftentimes people who study bees don't really talk to people who study ants. They don't talk to people who study termites, and God forbid they talk to somebody who studies aphids. And so each of these little subliteratures makes up their own terms to refer to the same thing. Reproductive division of labor between siblings from a shared mother, though, is called eusociality, right? And in bees, sometimes all those helper females can still be inseminated. They're typically not. Some of them could reproduce, but they typically don't. And it becomes more like a probability. Like she's kind like this daughter from this queen could reproduce and might reproduce a little bit, but mostly stays sterile. There's a lot of fuzziness between forced reproductive sterility and could reproduce under some circumstances in these weakly eusocial bees. So they reproduce sometimes, but not a lot, or they forego reproduction, but if some of the colony members die, they might start reproducing. So we call these intermediate positions weakly eusocial. Highly eusocial means that some of these daughters just cannot reproduce. Does not matter. They're never going to get mated. They're never going to produce daughters. At best, if their queen dies, they might reproduce some unfertilized eggs that become sons, drones. So eusociality is very high among the Apidae, which contain most of the bees that you know of, which include, like honeybees, genus Apis, but stingless bees as well. Meliponine bees are called stingless bees. They don't really have very elaborate stingers. Some of them still have stingers. Most of them do not sting, but they can still bite the hell out of you. So they can still swarm defend their colony in line with that fortress defense hypothesis for being the evolutionary precursor to eusociality. Bumblebees are also an Apidae, genus Bombus, and they are eusocial as well. Apidae, honeybees, and meliponine bees, the stingless bees, produce new colonies by swarming. So unlike ants that have those mating flights that then the queens that are inseminated descend onto the ground and form their own colonies, eusocial honeybees and eusocial stingless bees create new colonies through swarming. So a queen is produced by a parental society, and then she disperses with a retinue of workers, maybe a few hundred workers that join her in founding a new society, which means she's much more likely to be successful because she's not going it alone. She doesn't have to like forge it all anew on her own. She has a small workforce that assists her in all of those tasks. So they're much more likely to be successful if there's swarm founding. The same is true with stingless bees, meliponine bees. Bumblebees, we're back to being single colony founding events where there's a mating flight, they descend, they make a new colony by themselves. They produce the first set of workers that then assist their mother in creating the next set of workers, and then some of those subsequent generations will contain queens and drones. So bumblebees basically found colonies like wasps do once a year, and like most ants do as well. Eusociality has evolved, at least at weak levels, at least 3 times in the halictid sweat bees, and that's notable. So that if you're interested in like what causes the evolution of eusociality, you want to have multiple independent origins and be able to link environmental features with those origins to be able to say this kind of environment reliably produces eusociality in closely related taxa. So sweat bees have been a nice model for that because they've conveniently evolved eusociality many times, at least thrice. So, Apidae, almost all the bees that you can imagine when you think of a bee are in family Apidae. True honeybees are up on the top here, so of course that. You want to know what stingless bees, there are a lot of stingless bees, but here's some stingless bees on the right-hand side here. Bumblebees, those cute fuzzy things flying around, that can still sting you, so heads up. Allodipine bees, pictured here on the right, and then orchid bees on the bottom, which look totally unlike these other ones. These are all in one giant family, Apidae, and they're basically ranked here in coarse ascending order of sociality from bottom to top. So orchid bees can have primitively weakly eusocial species. Allodipine bees can have weakly eusocial species where there are workers, they don't reproduce, but hypothetically they could, and they might be inseminated, but they're morphologically quite similar to the queen, and some of them have a probability of becoming queens. So, it's fuzzy. Bumblebees, it becomes a little bit more strict here. So a lot of those offspring that are produced they look like the queen. They're about the same size as the queen, but they just don't have enough nutrients to be a founder of a new colony in the next year. And and their ovaries never really develop. So that's a little stricter kind of division of labor between the sisters that become queens and the sisters that just become sterile workers. Stingless bees and true honeybees, the queens are larger, their ovaries are fully developed, and there's a stricter division of labor where workers stay workers and do not reproduce and can't under most circumstances. All right, solitary bees. This is almost all the material you're ever going to hear about solitary bees. You almost never hear about them ever again in your life. That is a leaf cutting bee over to the right here. So carpenter bees, leaf cutter bees, mason bees. So every single one of these females flying around is reproductively totipotent. Totipotent means that you're capable of achieving all of the tasks necessary for you to be a functional organism on your own. So if you're reproductively totipotent, it means you can reproduce on your own. You are capable of doing that essential property of life. In a eusocial society, those sterile workers are not totipotent because they can't reproduce on their own. They can't make the next generation on their own. They are not totipotent, capable of all of the necessary features to be a functional organism on their own. And the queens are likewise not totipotent. They are reproductively totipotent, but they are not capable of executing all of the foraging tasks and colony maintenance tasks that are required for them to have successful offspring and produce more queens. And so in a highly eusocial society, no single member of the group is capable of achieving all of the things necessary to create the next generation. And so we call those things not totipotent societies. Queens are reproductively totipotent, workers are not reproductively totipotent, but the society in aggregate does not have totipotent workforce. If you are wondering like other words that you might be able to link totipotent to, think of pluripotent cells. Stem cells are pluripotent cells, which are capable of developing into all the possible cells that create your body. You just have to be programmed to become nervous tissue or muscle tissue or skeletal tissue or whatever, right? Connective tissue, just like pluripotent cells are capable of becoming any other type of cell in a human body, i.e. stem cells. A totipotent individual in a bee colony is capable of executing all of the tasks necessary for life to create the next generation. Okay, so they don't, singleton bees don't produce beeswax, they don't produce honey, you can't do any of that, and they usually don't sting unless you really, really tick them off, and then they're not that powerful of stingers, despite the fact that some of these species are huge. They, like the eusocial species, produce pollen that they provision to their young. Most of these families are described by their nest site preferences, which are usually in the ground or in plant material, and then they produce their own little cells inside of their nests that they create on their own, and they provision each cell with a bit of pollen, cap the cell so that the developing larvae only eats that pollen that's been provisioned in there, and then it emerges as its own reproductively totipotent individual, usually the next year or later on in that season. So they cap their cells and they provision the amount of nutrients that each larva is going to need to pupate into a mature bee. So solitary bees don't necessarily mean that they live on their own, right? So females of solitary bees oftentimes still cluster their nests next to each other. So although they each have their own little nest here that they have with their own cells, they can still cluster their nests together. In some extreme circumstances, there will be one shared entrance to a bunch of separate sacrosanct cell chambers for each of the mothers. So they're not rearing each other's offspring, but they do aggregate their nests together in some circumstances, and sometimes have a shared vestibule to their independent nests, which basically allows them to defend themselves collectively from enemies that might try to come and disturb them or steal resources or attack them. So they get this fortress defense benefit that eusocial insects oftentimes have, but they do that just by clustering their nests together, which is tempting to think of as an evolutionary precursor to truly eusocial species, and perhaps it is. We don't know. Anyway, we don't call these things colonies, we call them aggregations, because they're not really helping each other out all that much, except for in defense. So it's hard to know why bee biologists won't call this a colony, but whatever, they've decided that these are called aggregations. Colony proliferation, I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again now. There's usually, true honeybees and stingless bees form colonies via swarming. So a queen leaves her parental society with a retinue of small workforce of a few hundred workers that help her found a new colony. And although that's more expensive, from an energetic standpoint, producing a singleton queen and having her go found on her own is much cheaper from a colony's perspective. Queens that form colonies on their own are much less likely to establish successfully. Most of them die. So swarm founding societies provide their queen an additional buffer of having a retinue of workers that move with them. Moderately eusocial species like bombus, those bumblebees I talked about earlier, found colonies like wasps where singleton queens move on their own, produce their own workforces and have to go it all alone. So they're much less likely to succeed. Most of them fail, but it's energetically cheaper. So you basically say, I can't produce a lot of, you can either produce a small number of swarms to found new colonies or many, many, many queens that found societies on their own. So it's an R versus K selected strategy if you're familiar with ecology. So, and then the last topic is weakly eusocial species like these halictid bees on the right-hand side here exhibit geographic variation in eusociality, where the same species in cold climates will not be eusocial. Each and every offspring that a founding female produces will become a queen that founds a colony the next year, produces her own nest, but all of her female offspring will become queens. Oh, so they're not eusocial. They remain reproductively totipotent. But in warmer climates, the same species will exhibit weak levels of eusociality, more similar to bumblebees, where the founder produces offspring. The first set of offspring, which is usually just one generation of offspring, become sterile workers. None of them become queens. And then they help the mother produce the next generation, which will contain almost exclusively queens and drones. So in these weakly eusocial societies in warm climates, queen founds, she develops the first set of workers that stay workers, none of those are queens, and then they help their queen together in the next generation, which produces almost exclusively queens or drones. The same species in a cold climate, female forms the colony, she produces the first set of offspring, but those are all going to be queens. And basically it boils down to, is there enough time before it gets too godforsaken cold to have a second generation of workers? It would, I mean, if you don't have enough time to produce that second generation, then screw it. You're not going to have any helpers. Everything that you produce has to be a queen. You're going to produce very few of them, but that's just the way it is. In warm climates, you have just a few extra weeks to make those crappy workers that cannot found colonies on their own because they don't have enough resources, that then assist you in sending out another subset of offspring that can become reproductives and are better provisioned. So they are more likely to be able to found a society on their own. So if they have that flexible time, if they have that extra few weeks, they can become eusocial. If they don't, they stay just reproductively totipotent in these sweat bees. And these geographic variations have happened multiple times across multiple species, and they've become genetically fixed. So if you take these high elevation or cold climate non-eusocial species and these warm climate low elevation weakly eusocial species, and you rear them in lab, even under identical environmental conditions, they stick to their normal colony founding strategies for multiple generations, which conveys that this variation that we see across latitude and across elevation is genetically determined. And that experiment is called a common garden experiment. If the trait variation you see out there in the wild is retained when they're reared under identical developmental conditions in laboratory, then it provides evidence that what you're observing in terms of trait variation outside is genetically determined. If, however, it all went away and they all became weakly eusocial in lab, then it would have provided evidence that the variation you see outside is all environmentally determined and not genetically influenced. So different environments have caused local adaptation in the genes of these species so that some populations are eusocial and other populations are not. And they're probably intermediate elevation and intermediate temperature sites that are of a mixed strategy, but people don't really study those. So with that, that is our bee lecture. I beelined through that. I made a pun. I don't really like puns, but I beelined through that lecture relatively quickly. Next week you will have a lecture on sociality in reptiles and amphibians by moi. The end of next week, I'll probably do one on fish. And then you have guest lectures for avian sociality, i.e. birds, and spider sociality from my postdocs. So, and that will be the end of the course. I'm going to have lecture office hours in just a few minutes or at 2 o'clock, and I'll see you guys then. Take it easy. Have a good one. Bye.